Okay, so this presentation is going to be about the FSC BioLinks project, and which is a project that I ran for the FSC for 6 years. And I'm going to talk about the structured ID training pathways that we developed for invertebrate groups. So my name's Keiron. I'm a earthworm specialist more than anything, and I was the project manager. But I didn't do all this work alone, and I just want to acknowledge some of the individuals within the BioLinks team that were specifically involved in developing and delivering the ID training pathways, specifically the in-person courses. So Dr. Charlie Bell helped me develop them and ran them in the West Midlands for the first half of the project. In the second half of the project, they were delivered in the West Midlands by Rachel Davis and in the Southeast by Gino Brignoli. So I want to go back to before the main project started and talk a little bit about the consultation period, first of all. So the BioLinks project was looking at developing a training program to improve ID skills for under-recorded and difficult to ID groups. So in order to make sure that we got the project right, we wanted to speak to potential volunteers, existing biological recorders, biological recording professionals like local environmental record centres and recording schemes. So we did that through a 10-month consultation period, which involved a range of consultation methods, including hosting workshops where we got people together to discuss things that we were trying to figure out. We ran 11 of them, had 85 workshop attendees. We did an online survey, which got 369 responses. I did individual consultation with various stakeholders. And we also ran a site manager survey because we wanted to hear back from site managers about what the biological records that we'd be hoping to generate could feed back to them. So that took place between April 2016 and February 2017. And here are some of the results of some of the questions that we asked. So the report is available online through the Applied Ecology and Resources website. So one of the questions we asked, because when it first started, it wasn't about invertebrates, was, would you consider taking part in training to learn how to record the following groups? Now, I'm aware that not all taxonomic groups are here. We have to limit it somewhat, but there's a range of fungi, botanical, vertebrates and invertebrates there. And we can see, I think something that's quite striking is that most groups were getting close to 50% at least interest. So it told us that there was a demand for all taxonomic groups, regardless of how difficult they are to identify or how popular we see them as. And something I think that's quite interesting here is that some of the groups that you'd think would be the most popular, like birds, mammals, butterflies, were not necessarily the most popular. And that's because we have that NA category. So that was where people felt essentially that their ID skills were already at a level where they didn't need training. So we then asked our survey participants, which of the following groups do you believe should be prioritized by the project? So we established that people will go on ID training for any group, pretty much. When we asked them to tell us what they thought we should focus on, that difference between the well-established groups and the less, the more under-recorded groups really came out. So the top two categories, bees, wasps and ants, soil invertebrates, something that's really clear to me is those two groups have a really clear association with ecosystem services that we see as important, such as pollination, predator control, or soil health. So what came out of this was that there was a lot of invertebrate groups that seemed like people thought we should prioritize. Now, also high up there were things like lichens, fungi, mosses. However, we did decide to go with invertebrates because I thought it was going to be helpful to have a group of taxonomic groups, a range of taxonomic groups that we could use the same equipment, etc. for. So we decided that we would go with invertebrates, but we highlighted in the consultation report that the BioLinks methodology could be used for groups like lichens, fungi, mosses as well. We then asked people how they wanted to be trained. So one thing that became quite clear to me early on in the consultation was there was a lot of assumptions that were being made by conservation professionals, but without necessarily any evidence to back it up. So I was told you need to do your training on weekends so that if people are working, they'd be able to attend, and we need to do training in this way and that way. So I decided to ask some questions about it. And the first question I asked is, what is your preferred length of training course? So I gave them a few options: 1 day standalone, which is the traditional type of course that is delivered in this kind of project; 5-day residentials, which the FSC was obviously already doing; 2-day standalone courses; series of 1-day courses that are linked but are delivered over time; and would not attend courses. And what was really striking here is that people wanted development. They wanted 1-day courses which were easy for them to attend without doing a big commitment, either in time, money, annual leave, etc. But they didn't want standalone courses. They came out bottom. Second was the residential. So people did want residentials. I think the difference between the 1-day and the residentials, the series of 1-day and the residentials, was that big time commitment and potentially money. We also asked when they would attend training courses, and this completely disproved this theory that you need to do everything at weekends. So those professionals that work on natural history projects that end up having to work every weekend can now take a second look and go, do you know what, maybe we don't want to do that. 77% of our consultees said they had no preference. 4% said they only wanted it on weekdays, and 15% only on weekends. Now, what this told me as somebody developing a training program is that we probably need a range of weekend and weekday courses. We need to bear in mind that not everybody who works weekdays, and that some people might actually be attending as part of their job, as part of their professional development, and therefore might want to do so during the week. It may be that weekends are out of the question because of family commitments. So there's a lot more at play here than simply it should be weekends versus weekdays. So I put all of this information into a blog that's available on the Biological Recording Company website. So there's a link going in the chat to that where you can access that. And like I said, the report is available through the Applied Ecology Resources website as well, the full report. What we came up with for BioLinks was this volunteer learning pathway where we'd look at different levels and try and take people through those different levels. We defined our different levels based on 4 factors: knowledge, skills, confidence, and motivation. And we put together a 1-page document that categorized all of that, because one of the things that we were going to do is ask people to describe what level they were at the beginning of the project and at the end of the project for each species group. And we were also going to do that on each course. So on each training course, the people that were participating in that were asked to define themselves at the beginning and end of the course so we could measure progression. And we put together our training pathways in the consultation phase. So they categorized courses at these different levels, which were linked somewhat to the levels you're going to hear about in the FISC talk later. So we tried to kind of align them a little bit. Although FISC is obviously for plants and it's about assessment levels rather than training course levels. So within our training pathways, we had formal talk courses like the Microscope, Field ID, Learn to Love courses there, but we also had informal training opportunities. So our volunteer ID days and our field recorder days where people could come along for informal peer-to-peer and training. And we did all this under consultation with the recording schemes and professionals within the biological recording sector. So then we delivered the project. We got the money from the lottery. It was a £1.6 million project with a £1.2 million lottery bid. And we delivered absolutely loads of courses and events. So over 400 events, nearly 500 events. We did that across 47 venues and 6 FSC centres. Specifically, we had nearly 6,000 learners that attended those, 577 learner days, And really importantly, 51 expert tutors participated in those training courses, so in the delivery of that. And it generated over 10,000 records on iRecord through those activities as well. The project took place in 2 regions, the West Midlands and the South East. Now we had our core training facilities there, but we also went out to a range of other kind of outer training facilities to try and draw people more to the project. Yeah, if we break down those events a bit more, we had our introductory, field, microscope and residential events, as well as field recorder days and other workshops that were not formal talk courses and conferences. On those, we had high numbers of learners because all of the courses were subsidized as well. Yeah, again, big numbers, but I'm going to skip forward because we want to get to what we learned. So my first lesson learned here, and the first thing I changed, is we covered a lot of invertebrate groups. And that was to do with overexcitement from myself and the project team, and also wanting to make sure that we work with as many of the people that were involved in the consultation as possible. Looking back, knowing what I know now, I'd probably hone in on some of those groups a bit more. So I'd focus on a smaller number of invertebrate groups so that we could get more work done. If I had the power as well, I'd also cancel COVID so that didn't happen, because that had a big impact on the project. We had basically a year where we couldn't deliver training courses in person. So what did we find? So as I mentioned, every course we measured the progression of people, and we did that by getting people to say what level they were starting at, and we got them to fill that in at the beginning of the course. We collected in the sheets, and then at the end of the course we gave it back out and asked them to define what level they thought they were at the end. And then we gathered up that data for all of the people that attended, and we averaged out what the progression level was for various courses. And if we look at those learner metrics by the different taxonomic groups, some interesting things occurred. So the progression was not always equal for all groups. We also got people to measure their enjoyment and usefulness out of 5. So here you've got the top 5 taxonomic groups for each of the different measures: progression, enjoyment, usefulness. Some things that came out there, we see that earthworms are top in terms of progression. One of the reasons for that might be that there's no such thing as a field ID of earthworms course. So it might be related to the types of courses that we're running. We can see that false scorpions or pseudoscorpions come out high in everything we do. In usefulness, quite interestingly, we've got stoneflies, false scorpions, mayflies, dragonflies, and damselflies. That could be that it's an impact of giving additional training to people that might do other freshwater invert surveys, so the riverfly surveys where they don't take things to species level. So we were possibly developing skills in a group that they were already involved in. What's quite interesting, if you look at these groups, most of these groups that are ranking quite high are groups where there's a relatively small number of species. Things like beetles, flies, bees, ranking less high, probably because they're more difficult and there's a broader range of species. So when we look at the opposite end of that, some of the things that came out lower in terms of usefulness were things like snails. Not surprising really, because the aid gap guide that we've got for snails is quite old now. It's quite old school. I think people found it a bit more difficult. Spiders, I personally think spiders can be really difficult to ID. So yeah, some of the more difficult groups were possibly coming out lower because of that. And progression and usefulness seem to be quite well linked. So a little bit about the different types of courses that we ran. Our introductory courses, or our Learn to Love courses as we call them, they were all about engaging people with these groups and recruiting them. They weren't focused on ID. They didn't involve specimen collecting in the sense of taking specimens and then killing them, and they didn't involve microscopes. People found them really informative. Some things that I can feedback that we found, some anecdotal things, was that people wouldn't travel far for these. If you're going to do introductory level courses, you need to have marketing strategy within that very local area. So where we did Learn to Love courses kind of really on the edge of our regions, we found that people weren't moving, people that were coming to that may be different to the other end of the region. And if they were too far away from the main hub, we wouldn't get people then going on to the field ID courses, the next step. They were also the hardest to recruit for. So they were by far the hardest courses to fill. And I believe that is probably to do with the fact that they have that smallest catchment area. So these are the courses that you're going to be commonly seeing also delivered by other conservation organizations as well. So there's maybe a lot of competition, and that competition quite often are not charging or are charging very, very low costs. So I think this is something that's really difficult to make commercially viable in the future. Next along in the pathway, we've got the field identification courses. These often focus on a relatively small number of species. So we weren't saying, come along and we'll teach you how to identify everything in the field. We were focusing on more distinctive species that you can ID in the field. And they had a focus on using field ID guides. So for example, using the Wild Guide to spiders, or using an FSC fold out guide to longhorns or ladybirds or something like that. Again, we didn't use microscopes. We wanted to clearly define what these were and keep them at that beginner level. But we did introduce recording. And what we wanted people to take away from this was that if you've done this course, even if you can just identify a few species that are really distinctive, you can go away and make your records, submit your records to iRecord, and they're useful. And people did report that it gave them confidence in using ID guides and producing biological records. And they also felt that it gave them that confidence to then go on the next step and do a microscope course. And that brings us on to the microscope courses. So these were all at the intermediate or advanced level. Now, what we found with these were people were starting to come from further afield, especially when we were doing it on quite specialist groups or quite niche groups where there wasn't really much going on in the rest of the country. So people rated these quite high in usefulness because they got to develop skills, they got to use our microscopes. I think a barrier that I noticed for people taking these skills forward was where people don't have access to their own microscope. And then finally, we had the residential courses, and these really they scored high across the board, and I'll have a look at that in a second. They basically combined all the courses that we've previously talked about together. So the identifying and recording bumblebees course would combine Learn to Love bees with field ID of bumblebees and microscope ID of bumblebees as well. So it would combine all of them across three days from Friday to Sunday, and our learners got to do that course basically pretty intensively. People reported that it made the travel worthwhile. It really reinforced and built their skills. But something it did that the other courses didn't do to the same extent was it built a community. The participants got to know each other a lot better. They went to the pub with each other and with the tutor in the evening. So they formed stronger bonds. And I'm pleased to report that some of the BioLinks volunteers that took part in these, both in the West Midlands and the South East, are still continuing to liaise with each other and do recording activities together. There's a WhatsApp group for the South East ones where, and that's really, really active still to this day. And it was set up by the participants, not by tutors or staff. So if we look at the data, we gathered all this data. That's really what I want to report back to you. What did it tell us about these different groups? Well, what we learned was people enjoy the courses no matter what. So regardless of the type of course, everybody enjoyed it. And those skills, those enjoyment scores were pretty consistent across. It was kind of similar with the usefulness. The difficulty with looking at these scores is that people tended to score everything quite high for the enjoyment and usefulness anyway. So even a relatively small difference, like we can see with the microscope and residential versus the field introductory may even be significant. So we did find that for usefulness, the microscope and residential courses seem to score a bit higher. And I think that's because of the level of the skills that were being taught, not really skills that it's easy to learn on your own. But I think the thing that I'd really like to highlight here is the progression metric. So it was quite a bit higher for residentials. So what this taught us is that although the introductory field and microscope courses are all important, and we should continue to look at doing that, residential courses are really, really vital for skill development, and they came out top for everything. So it's really important that we retain these within the sector and look at ways of incorporating them in training programs. BioLinks was a biological recording project, so it's important that we do talk about how many records that we gathered. Did it do the job? Well, when we questioned our participants, we did find that we generated over 35,000 records. So that wasn't 35 records directly generated by BioLinks, but generated by the people that participated in the project during the course of the project. So yeah, and the average was 129 records per recorder. So what that tells us is a small number of recorders were contributing quite a large number of records. So some general conclusions. First of all, everybody loves pseudoscorpions, false scorpions. They were really popular, and they're a group that pretty much get ignored. So we should do more on false scorpions. The average enjoyment and useful scores were high, regardless of the taxonomic group or the course level. So people do find these useful and they do enjoy them. So they're great to put in lottery projects, etc., just for showing that people have developed skills and enjoyed themselves. Progression was highest in taxonomic groups that had few species, so less than 60. Residential courses were enjoyed the most. They were considered the most useful and particularly showed the highest progression. So it's important that we do not let residential courses fall out of the sector's training provision. Learners were prepared to travel from outside or expecting catchments for residentials, and to a lesser extent, the microscope ID courses. The percentage of attendees who generated biological records was lower than hoped. So when we're putting together training programs for generating biological records, we need to take that into consideration and put in more training and set realistic targets. However, a small number of dedicated recorders really can generate a large volume of records. So it's also important that we have projects that put a lot of time and effort and skill development into a small number of people as well. So things like internships, apprenticeships, traineeships are projects that should be considered for the future as well. So I now want to look at one training pathway as a case study and show you what we did and what we learned for that. So I've chose the Odonata or dragonfly and damselfly ID training pathway. So this is the training program that we put together at the beginning of the project. And I just want to show you what we learned from what we delivered. So if we look at our field ID courses, these are the stats that I've got from that. So we delivered 6 field ID courses across the 2 regions, 71 course attendees, scored relatively high in usefulness and enjoyment. And we had an average level change of about 1+1. So, but not all of the field ID courses that we delivered were the same. We tried experimenting a little bit, and I want to show you what we learned from that because it showed us some quite nice things. So we had 3 different field ID courses. We had field ID of damselflies all one day, field ID of dragonflies, and field ID of dragonflies and damselflies combined. They didn't all come out with the same average level of progression. So these are the results that we got, and I've given some estimates of why I think they've come out like this. So first of all, field ID of damselflies came out highest, and it came out fairly significantly higher as well. So my theory behind this is that damselflies can be a bit trickier. They're smaller. There's a lot of blue ones that look the same. So people can find that a bit more difficult, and maybe that's what they want to get most out of an ID course when they go to learn about dragonflies and damselflies. So maybe that's why the progression was higher. Dragonflies, looking at the reverse of that, they're bigger, distinctive species, so a bit easier. But what was really interesting is when we combined the two groups together, we got an even lower average progression level. And my theory behind that is that it's too much information for one day. The feedback that we got from people was that they were a bit overwhelmed. So when we're designing our training courses, we need to kind of take a step outside of thinking this is what we've always done and think about the learner. What is a manageable amount of information that that learner can take in within one day? And there's nothing wrong with spreading out a group that is maybe traditionally covered in one day across several courses. So maybe dragonflies and damselflies should be separated out into 2 courses, maybe even more. We need to play around with this more and think of it from a learner perspective, not from us as a conservation organisation or environmental educator or associate tutor perspective. And then if we look at the microscope courses, we only did 4 larvae ID microscope courses, 32 attendees. Again, good usefulness and enjoyment scores. But what happens when we look at the progression score and break it down? So this time, the differences are between regions. So the 2 courses, one looking at dragonfly and damselfly larvae and exivia was the West Midlands, and dragonfly and damsel larvae in the southeast. And there was one key difference between these. The second one in the West Midlands involved using 2 ID resources. So it was one day, and we give them 2 ID resources, and we train them how to use both. And the progression score crashed. And the feedback that we got from participants was that they had really struggled to get to grips with 2 ID courses in one day. Now, it is actually quite important that we teach people how to use those 2 ID resources, because they both are important in different ways for learning how to ID Odonata larvae. So it's not that we shouldn't do that, but maybe if we're going to do that, we should spread that across 2 courses. So either convert it into a 2-day course where we teach 1 ID resource on day 1 and 1 ID resource on day 2, or separate them into 2 separate 1-day courses. So what did we learn just from looking at the Odonata training? The average enjoyment and usefulness scores, as always, were high regardless of course level. Progression was impacted by course structure. So when we look at differences that we did in the course structure, that really did make a difference. And specifically, 1 day is not enough time to teach field ID of Odonata. Learners benefit from separating out damselfly and dragonflies into 1-day courses. They might benefit even further if we separate that out even more. 1-day larval microscope courses should focus on the use of a single ID resource. If multiple ID resources are to be taught, they should be taught over multiple days. So the adapted Odonata ID training course coming from that looks like this. So it's not a lot different, but we've separated out the microscope courses in a different way to how we've separated out the, in the same way to how we've separated out damselflies and dragonflies, where we just teach 1/2 on each day. But likewise, you could do this focusing on a specific ID guide as well. So other examples of conclusions that we got from some of the species data was that slug dissection courses do not do well. We could not get people to book on these no matter how much we push them. So if we want to teach slug dissection, which we do need to teach if we're going to get people to be able to ID all British slugs to species, it needs to be folded into a longer slug ID courses. So for example, you could put it in a 2-day slug identification course where the first day you use just visible features with a microscope, and then you do this dissection on day 2. Or alternatively, you could put it into a residential course where you cover everything, field ID, microscope and dissection. But if you try and sell it as a standalone product, it won't do well. And since doing this, the Tiniptra project have told me that they've struggled to get people on slug dissection as well. So it's not just a BioLinks thing. Large groups like beetles, flies and bees they all benefit from having a to family or genera course. So by this, I mean, the first microscope course shouldn't be going straight to species. It should be going to family level for flies and beetles or genera level for bees. And that gets people familiar with the general taxonomy of the group and some of the ID features they'll be using afterwards. And then from there, you would lead on with further courses looking at different genera or families. So, for example, with flies, we always did it to family, but some of the courses would be 2 days or maybe even longer, where it was a big fly group. Again, it's about focusing the ID course on a specific ID guide. And there are some really good, there's a really good fly family key that we use for that course specifically. Field ID courses work best when they're teaching the ID resource and not the individual species. So it was something that I come to term death by PowerPoint, where we go through every single species that we've got and tell them all about that. People don't retain that knowledge. What's better is to teach them how to use the ID course, teach them where the ID course has maybe got problems or nuances, or teaching them what symbols mean within the ID course so that they feel confident going out and using it. And if you're going to focus on species, focus on a relatively small number in a bit of detail rather than trying to rush through everything. I wouldn't focus on more than 10 to 12 species in a single day. Whereas if you're teaching the ID resource, it kind of more will depend on what you find when you go out, but you can teach on that instead as an alternative. And learners don't like to know what specimen they're working on in a microscope ID course. So where we're bringing in specimens, our learners reported that they prefer if the specimens are labeled with mystery numbers or letters. And there's several different ways you can structure how they'll work through the specimens you've brought in, but they liked to have unknown specimens. They reported that when they were given a specimen with a name on, they would cheat. The second they got into trouble, they would cheat and they'd work backwards. And you might give them the name of something and allow them to work backwards when you've got unnamed, but it means they can't default to cheating. So yeah, don't tell them what they're looking at. Let them work through it and then intervene when they're having issues. Likewise, if you can come up with worksheets to help guide them, they found that really useful as well. So it might be about drawing certain features. It might be about mapping out certain features on a specimen before they even look at the key. That was really useful for things like woodlice, for earthworms. With earthworms, it's quite numerical because you're looking at segment numbers, things around, so it prevents people having to go back and forward from the key. That obviously only works on species groups where you've got a relatively small number of characters that you're looking at on each species, and it's the same characters for each species. Okay, I also found that it was really useful to take all these lessons that we learned, and I delivered a course within the project called Teaching Natural History. So this is one of our tutors, Katie Potts, who came on the course. The tutors that came on this course reported that they found it really, really useful. So I tried to introduce some teaching theory, but I kept it completely within the context of teaching natural history, specifically ID courses. And I still teach that course today. So if anyone needs it for any projects, whatever, they can get in touch, and I'm happy to teach that for them. Really, really useful. So some recommendations that I've got from the BioLinks project: clearly defined and realistic learning objectives are vital to ensuring trainee progression. We need to design our training like professional educators rather than thinking about how we've always done it. So think from the learner's perspective. Consideration should be given to splitting large groups for both field and microscope courses. And we need sector-wide agreement on a structured training pathways with and that will in turn will increase recorder skill levels. So we need to stop working in our silos and we need to work together, which is exactly why I've brought about this virtual symposium, and work together on that. Online training is becoming more and more important, and both webinars and online courses should be incorporated into structured training pathways. So in this August, I'll be launching the Natural History Training Academy, Virtual Academy. and that'll be starting with an earthworm course. But I'm looking for partners to develop and deliver more training. So if that's something that is interest of you and your organisation, then please do get in touch. I'm already lined up to be working with the British Dragonfly Society and some others, so please do get in touch. Training courses are not enough. To develop people, we need informal learning opportunities such as mentoring, peer-to-peer learning. So they should be incorporated into training plans. If you're developing a project, make sure you've got things like field recorder days, lab days, etc. Within that. I highly recommend having local conferences as well to get people together, to get them socialized, and to share information on local projects that they might be able to develop their skills within as well. Natural history tutors need to approach training courses from a teacher perspective, not a natural history recorder perspective. Residential courses, I can't stress enough, are vital to build bonds between learners as well as significant skills progression. Losing them damages sector skills development. And there is a real hunger for natural history training. All species groups should be targeted. There's no need for us to keep doing the same thing again and again, although we should make sure we've got annual cycles of training running. So what's next? So I developed the BioLinks development plan for training provision during the project, and that, alongside all other project documentation, is available publicly via the Applied Ecology Resources platform. So all the links are going in the chat to all of those documents. Please do access them, use them, reference them in your projects as well. We want that information to be shared. I do plan on developing the development plan for training provision into an Invertebrate ID training plan. It's when I get the time, it's not funded. So as and when, I do plan on developing those training pathways further. And I plan on doing that in liaison with the Field Studies Council and the recording schemes and anyone else who wants to be part of that. Following on from this, we've got the Natural History Online Training Virtual Symposium. So that's why I haven't really talked much about the online training today, because we're going to delve into that in more detail in October. There's a link in the chat if anybody would like to book on that. And we'll be hearing from the FSC about what's happened with their training program, as well as from me on webinars and others as well. And I've also taken some aspects of the BioLinks project which the FSC is not focusing on. So they're really focusing on the structured training pathways, the online training, the in-person training. I'm focusing a bit more on the webinar aspect, and the field recorder days. So the Ento Live training webinar program is a series of engagement webinars that tell people about invertebrate research. So they're all free to attend, and there's the full program is available to book in the chat. I've also got the Ento Learn webinar series, which takes some of the learning out of those ID courses and puts it into 1 hour webinars. So taking what I've learned, we focus on a small number of species, usually between 8 and 10, and give a bit of information about those species for people. They're all available again online, and they're all delivered in partnership with relevant organisations. So Damselflies of the UK is with British Dragonfly Society, Bumblebees of the UK is with Bumblebee Conservation Trust, etc. So have a look at the programme online. We've already done Longhorns as well. I also thought there's probably a need to develop some of the more professional skills as well. So I've got my Skills for Ecology webinar series, and the first 2 runs of webinars within that are on drones and crayfish surveying. So again, the link's in the chat to look at them in more detail. And finally, I think it's really important that we continue doing the field recorder days where we're generating biodiversity data and also providing an informal situation where people can learn. So I run a series of them by working with a range of projects across London. And I've got dragonflies coming up in July and some fungi ones coming up in October. If there's anybody listening to this presentation that would like to incorporate field recorder days within their training program or future projects, then please do get in touch. That's something that I can do quite extensively in London, but I also have contacts across the country, and I'd be really excited to get involved in more projects about that want to incorporate biological recording and species ID skills development within their program. So finally, I'd just like to say, yeah, if you want to get in touch, my email is info@biologicalrecording.co.uk. I welcome questions before we move on. And that is it from me.